Part 2, Chapter 10 of O Pioneers. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. O Pioneers by Willa, Cather. Part 2, Neighboring Fields. Chapter 10. While Emil and Carl were amusing themselves at the fair, Alexandra was at home, busy with her account books, which had been neglected of late. She was almost through with her figures when she heard a cart drive up to the gate, and looking out of the window she saw her two older brothers. They had seemed to avoid her ever since Carl Lindström's arrival, 4 weeks ago that day, and she hurried to the door to welcome them. She saw at once that they had come with some very definite purpose. They followed her stiffly into the sitting-room. Oscar sat down, but Lou walked over to the window and remained standing, his hands behind him. "You are by yourself?" he asked, looking toward the doorway into the parlor. "Yes, Carl and Emil went up to the Catholic fair." For a few moments neither of the men spoke. Then Lou came out sharply. "How soon does he intend to go away from here?" "I don't know, Lou. Not for some time, I hope." Alexandra spoke in an even, quiet tone that often exasperated her brothers. They felt that she was trying to be superior with them. Oscar spoke up grimly. "We thought we ought to tell you that people have begun to talk," he said meaningly. Alexandra looked at him. "What about?" Oscar met her eyes blankly. "About you, keeping him here so long. It looks bad for him to be hanging on to a woman this way. People think you're getting taken in." Alexandra shut her account book firmly. "Boys," she said seriously, "don't let's go on with this. We won't come out anywhere. I can't take advice on such a matter. I know you mean well, but you must not feel responsible for me in things of this sort. If we go on with this talk it will only make hard feeling." Lou whipped about from the window. "You ought to think a little about your family. You're making us all ridiculous." "How am I?" "People are beginning to say you want to marry the fellow." "Well, and what is ridiculous about that?" Lou and Oscar exchanged outraged looks. "Alexandra, can't you see he's just a tramp and he's after your money? He wants to be taken care of, he does." "Well, suppose I want to take care of him. Whose business is it but my own?" "Don't you know he'd get hold of your property?" "He'd get hold of what I wished to give him, certainly." Oscar sat up suddenly, and Lou clutched at his bristly hair. "Give him!" Lou shouted. "Our property? Our homestead?" "I don't know about the homestead," said Alexandra quietly. "I know you and Oscar have always expected that it would be left to your children, and I'm not sure but what you're right. But I'll do exactly as I please with the rest of my land, boys." "The rest of your land!" cried Lou, growing more excited every minute. "Didn't all the land come out of the homestead? It was bought with money borrowed on the homestead, and Oscar and me worked ourselves to the bone paying interest on it." "Yes, you paid the interest, but when you married we made a division of the land, and you were satisfied. I've made more on my farms since I've been alone than when we all worked together." "Everything you've made has come out of the original land that us boys worked for, hasn't it? The farms and all that comes out of them belongs to us as a family." Alexandra waved her hand impatiently. "Come now, Lou, stick to the facts. You are talking nonsense. Go to the county clerk and ask him who owns my land, and whether my titles are good." Lou turned to his brother. "This is what comes of letting a woman meddle in business," he said bitterly. "We ought to have taken things in our own hands years ago, but she liked to run things, and we humored her. We thought you had good sense, Alexandra. We never thought you'd do anything foolish." Alexandra rapped impatiently on her desk with her knuckles. "Listen, Lou, don't talk wild. You say you ought to have taken things into your own hands years ago. I suppose you mean before you left home. But how could you take hold of what wasn't there? I've got most of what I have now since we divided the property. I've built it up myself, and it has nothing to do with you." Oscar spoke up solemnly. "The property of a family really belongs to the men of the family, no matter about the title. If anything goes wrong, it's the men that are held responsible." "Yes, of course," Lou broke in. "Everybody knows that. Oscar and me have always been easy-going, and we've never made any fuss. We were willing you should hold the land and have the good of it, but you got no right to part with any of it. We worked in the fields to pay for the first land you bought, and whatever's come out of it has got to be kept in the family." Oscar reinforced his brother, his mind fixed on the one point he could see. The property of a family belongs to the men of the family, because they are held responsible, and because they do the work. Alexandra looked from one to the other, her eyes full of indignation. She had been impatient before, but now she was beginning to feel angry. "And what about my work?" she asked in an unsteady voice. Lou looked at the carpet. "Oh, no, Alexandra, you always took it pretty easy. Of course we wanted you to. You liked to manage round, and we always humored you. We realize you were a great deal of help to us. There's no woman anywhere around that knows as much about business as you do, and we've always been proud of that, and thought you were pretty smart. But of course, the real work always fell on us. Good advice is all right, but it don't get the weeds out of the corn." "Maybe not, but it sometimes puts in the crop, and it sometimes keeps the fields for corn to grow in," said Alexandra dryly. "Why, Lou, I can remember when you and Oscar wanted to sell this homestead and all the improvements to old Preacher Erickson for $2,000. If I'd consented, you'd have gone down to the river and scraped along on poor farms for the rest of your lives. When I put in our first field of alfalfa you both opposed me, just because I first heard about it from a young man who had been to the university. You said I was being taken in then, and all the neighbors said so. You know as well as I do that alfalfa has been the salvation of this country. You all laughed at me when I said our land here was about ready for wheat, and I had to raise 3 big wheat crops before the neighbors quit putting all their land in corn. Why, I remember you cried, Lou, when we put in the first big wheat planting, and said everybody was laughing at us." Lou turned to Oscar. "That's the woman of it. She tells you to put in a crop. She thinks it's put in. It makes women conceited to meddle in business. I shouldn't think you'd want to remind us how hard you were on us, Alexandra, after the way you baby Emil." "Hard on you? I never meant to be hard. Conditions were hard. Maybe I would never have been very soft anyhow, but I certainly didn't choose to be the kind of girl I was. If you take even a vine and cut it back again and again, it grows hard, like a tree." Lou felt that they were wandering from the point, and that in digression Alexandra might unnerve him. He wiped his forehead with a jerk of his handkerchief. "We never doubted you, Alexandra. We never questioned anything you did. You've always had your own way, but you can't expect us to sit like stumps and see you done out of the property by any loafer who happens along, and making yourself ridiculous into the bargain." Oscar rose. "Yes," he broke in, "everybody's laughing to see you get took in. At your age, too. Everybody knows he's nearly 5 years younger than you, and is after your money. Why, Alexandra, you are 40 years old." "All that doesn't concern anybody but Carl and me. Go to town and ask your lawyers what you can do to restrain me from disposing of my own property, and I advise you to do what they tell you, for the authority you can exert by law is the only influence you will ever have over me again." Alexandra rose. "I think I would rather not have lived to find out what I have today," she said quietly, closing her desk. Lou and Oscar looked at each other questioningly. There seemed to be nothing to do but to go, and they walked out. "You can't do business with women," Oscar said heavily as he clambered into the cart. "But anyhow, we've had our say at least." Lou scratched his head. "Talk of that kind might come too high, you know, but she's apt to be sensible. You hadn't ought to said that about her age, though, Oscar. I'm afraid that hurt her feelings, and the worst thing we can do is make her sore at us. She'd marry him out of contrariness." "I only meant," said Oscar, "that she is old enough to know better, and she is. If she was going to marry, she ought to done it long ago, and not go making a fool of herself now." Lou looked anxious, nevertheless. Of course, he reflected hopefully, and inconsistently, Alexandra ain't much like other women folks. Maybe it won't make her sore. Maybe she'd as soon be 40 as not. End of Chapter 10 of Part 2.